ArcfieldWeather.com meteorologist Paul Dorian here on Thursday morning, September 15th. We have now reached the midpoint of the month of September. This is right around the climatological peak of the Atlantic Basin tropical season. Indeed, we have a new tropical storm, Fiona, to talk about. We'll talk about the potential scenarios over the next several days. There's wide-ranging scenarios with respect to the ultimate movement of what is now tropical storm Fiona. It is currently moving due west and is unlikely to reach hurricane levels, at least over the next 24 to 48 hours or so. It's kind of in a pseudo favorable environment now. There's enough dry air around and wind shear around likely to prevent it from intensifying into a hurricane, at least over the next couple of days. This is the current location right now, and this is the forecast track, the latest forecast track by NOAA's National Hurricane Center. They tend to agree with that earlier statement that it's unlikely to reach hurricane level, at least over the next couple of days. The S here represents their thinking that it stays as a tropical storm over the next few days, and it looks like, very likely, it'll have a big impact on some of the Caribbean islands like Puerto Rico, potentially Hispaniola, which has Dominican Republic on its eastern side and Haiti on the western side. This is the scenario over the next few days going into the latter part of the weekend. Puerto Rico right here could very well have a direct hit by Tropical Storm Fiona sometime over the, let's say, the middle part of the upcoming weekend. Here is Hispaniola, and one thing I want to point out here, we talk about this often during tropical season. That particular Caribbean island, Hispaniola, has some high terrain, so any kind of a movement directly over that island could result in some weakening of a tropical system. The current track here by the Hurricane Center has it kind of skirting the eastern edge of Hispaniola and then up to the north and west. Whether or not it takes this track or directly over is only a small difference, but a potential big impact. Again, a movement directly over Hispaniola would tend to have a weakening impact, at least a temporary weakening impact on Fiona, as again it has some high terrain, as does Cuba, by the way. It has some high mountains there as well, which tend to weaken tropical systems. So it's just too close of a call right now to determine exactly how it moves over Hispaniola during the latter part of the upcoming weekend into the early part of next week. But again, for now, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti stay on guard for potential impact from Tropical Storm Fiona later in the weekend going into the early part of next week. Beyond that, here's where the differences arise. One scenario has the system moving out over the Bahamas and then kind of curving up to the north and kind of meandering around off the eastern seaboard for potentially several days. Another potential scenario has it moving across the Florida Straits, maybe right over the Keys, and then spilling out over into the Gulf of Mexico. And we'll talk about the differences in those scenarios and the reasons why there may be different scenarios at this particular time during the rest of the video discussion. Well, before we get to a couple different computer forecast models, I want to take a look at the GFS as well as the Canadian model, because the Canadian model has the Gulf of Mexico, if you will, scenario. The GFS certainly has a recurvature up over the Bahamas and then off the eastern seaboard. This is a particular plot here that comes from Toomer Berg's tropical cyclone website. Very interesting. He puts together all these different models here. The ECMWF is the European model, the NOAA's GFS model, and the UK Met model. Deterministic is the operational version of these particular models, and also included on this particular plot the ensemble runs of these particular models. So what we can see here, we can move forward in time from the current time period and just go ahead a few days, and we'll see most of the models tend to agree with movement near Puerto Rico right at this particular time during the upcoming weekend, then somewhere close to Hispaniola during the latter part of the upcoming weekend. And this is where the divergence really starts to set in. We can move forward here and notice this wide spread with some members going into the Gulf of Mexico, and then this particular scenario, other ensemble members cutting up to the north and east. This is probably the favored scenario right as we speak right now, cutting over the Bahama Islands and then moving to a position off the eastern seaboard by next week. Again, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, likely to have a direct impact during the upcoming weekend, and that's where the discrepancies will begin. And one of the causes of this kind of split with a Gulf of Mexico scenario or an off the eastern seaboard scenario is related to the strength of the storm and how quickly it can intensify. Again, I mentioned up front, unlikely to become a hurricane over the next day or two. There's just only moderately favorable conditions right now, some dry air, some wind shear. But ultimately, as it intensifies, the timing of that intensification, if it strengthens quickly into a stronger storm, tends to become more and more influenced by the upper air flow, and that is the scenario here. This is generally with those computer forecast models that tend to intensify the storm quickly, and it then becomes influenced by the upper air flow and will turn to the north and east. The Canadian model, for example, tends to keep it as a weaker system, not as influenced by the upper air flow, and it allows it to kind of become influenced by a ridge moving over the U.S., and we'll show that in a moment here, allowing it to move into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, let's move through both operational runs here of the GFS first and then the CMC, that's the Canadian model, just to show the widely varying scenarios outlined here for Tropical Storm Fiona. This is at the beginning of the time period here from the 0Z run of the GFS. This is our early Thursday morning. Here is Fiona. Let's just quickly move forward here and watch this particular scenario here. It moves out over the Caribbean islands here. Notice that millibars by the time we get to Sunday evening, 995. This is Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Haiti. It's already starting kind of a turn to the north and east in this particular forecast run here. 983 millibars, so it intensifies it rather quickly compared to the CMC model, the Canadian model. Again, when that happens, it tends to become more and more influenced by upper air winds. It'll tend to curve farther and farther to the north, and that is what the GFS is suggesting right now. That kind of meanders around for several days here, and certainly this is well down the road now. We're all the way out to Friday of next week, so 8 days away. GFS model run from last night has it sitting out over the western Atlantic as a very strong storm, 954 millibars at this particular time. Now let's jump over to the Canadian model. And here we go, the Canadian model, same starting point here on Thursday morning, Tropical Storm Fiona. But let's move forward here. And again, I mentioned the difference in the strength of the storm. Look at this, it's only a 1007 millibar low by the time we get to Sunday evening. It's considerably weaker than the GFS model, and it tends to be less influenced if it's a weaker system by the upper air wind flow. And in this particular case, that allows it to slide across the Florida Straits into the Gulf of Mexico, according to the 0Z run of the Canadian model. Here we go, still rather weak system compared to the GFS. Now it's strengthening quite a bit as it moves over the Keys here. We're a week away from right now. This is next Thursday, September 22nd. Then it continues to move out over the Gulf of Mexico. This is 8 days away. Friday evening of next week, right over the northern Gulf of Mexico. At the same time, the GFS model had the system way out over the western Atlantic Ocean. Now let's get back to the GFS model. I want to take a look at the 500 millibar height anomaly forecast, because these are some of the key players into the ultimate track of Fiona. We start off today with a upper level low sitting here over northern New England, a touch of fall next few days for the mid-Atlantic region, New England, probably the coolest night so far. DC, Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, and all surrounding suburbs in the overnight hours. It'll be pushing the 50-degree mark in many spots, maybe in the upper 40s in a lot of locations. Now let's quickly move forward here. Again, this is a GFS model, and we'll see Fiona right here reflected at 500 millibars over the upcoming weekend. This is during the middle and latter part of the upcoming weekend. Again, Puerto Rico right here, Hispaniola right here. A ridge of high pressure from the Hudson Bay region of Canada extending into the northeastern part of the nation. It kind of retrogrades a little bit and builds up across the central plains. That'll become a key player at this particular time. By the time we get to the middle part of next week, now Wednesday, now a week from today, notice the position of this ridge. It's over the upper part of the Midwest, extending out across the northeastern part of the nation. This is, again, a week from today, next Thursday morning, September 22nd. Here's the reflection of Fiona at this particular time at the 500 millibar level. Now, let's just jump to the Canadian model right here for the same time period. This is next Thursday morning on the Canadian model. This is next Thursday morning on the GFS model. And notice the difference in this location of the ridging right here by these particular models. The center of this ridge on the GFS over the Midwest really kind of extends up into this region right here, and that compares to the Canadian model, which is farther to the south with its center location of that ridge, and that tends to allow the tropical system to undercut it and move out into the Gulf of Mexico. So those subtle differences in the upper air pattern will be very important, and it's just too early to call right now. If there's a favored scenario, it's probably the one that curves to the north over the Bahamas and then into the western part of the Atlantic Ocean. Before we get there, certainly a direct impact of Puerto Rico is a possibility over the upcoming weekend, and beyond that, Hispaniola, Dominican Republic on the eastern side of that island, and Haiti on the western side. After that, we'll see exactly what happens, but again, we talked about the potential scenarios down the road, but of immediate impact, watch out those northern Caribbean islands. That's it for now. For ArcfieldWeather.com, I'm meteorologist Paul Orion.